The night had just begun its descent into the inky abyss of darkness when Clara, a young nurse just a few months into her new job, clocked in for another overnight shift at the long-term care facility. The building was a relic of an earlier time, its aged walls whispering of lives that had passed within its confines. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the faint odor of decay, a constant reminder of the fragile line between life and death that lingered in every corner. Clara had always been intrigued by the night shift. There was something calming about the stillness of the late hours when the world outside seemed to slow down, almost to a standstill. The patients, too, were mostly quiet during these hours, their frail bodies surrendering to the exhaustion of another day. But tonight, as she settled into her routine, a shiver of unease crept up her spine, an inexplicable sense of foreboding that she couldn't quite shake. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, each second passing with a resounding click that echoed through the empty hallways. Clara made her rounds, checking on the patients, adjusting their blankets, and ensuring they were comfortable. Most were fast asleep, their chests rising and falling with the steady rhythm of their breath. But as she approached room 217, a sudden chill gripped her, causing her to hesitate. The resident of room 217 was an elderly woman named Mrs. Whitaker, who had been at the facility for several years. She was a quiet soul, rarely speaking except to request the occasional glass of water, or to ask if it was time for her medication. Clara had always found her to be polite and pleasant, but tonight something was different. The room felt unusually cold, and the air seemed to hum with an energy that Clara couldn't quite place. As she opened the door, the first thing she noticed was the oppressive darkness that swallowed the room. The small lamp on the bedside table flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. Mrs. Whitaker was awake, her eyes wide and filled with a terror that Clara had never seen before. "Mrs. Whitaker, is everything all right?" Clara asked softly, stepping closer to the bed. The old woman's hands were trembling, clutching the thin blanket as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. "It's here," Mrs. Whitaker whispered, her voice barely audible over the thudding of Clara's heart. "It's in the bathroom." Clara frowned, glancing towards the small ensuite bathroom that was shrouded in darkness. She reached for the light switch, but as her fingers brushed against it, the light in the main room flickered again, then went out completely. The room was plunged into pitch-black darkness, and for a moment Clara's breath caught in her throat. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Mrs. Whitaker's ragged breathing. Clara's hand fumbled for her flashlight, her fingers trembling as she clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the bathroom door. It was ajar, and a cold draft seeped out from within, caressing Clara's face with icy fingers. "Please, make it go away," Mrs. Whitaker pleaded, her voice quivering with fear. "It doesn't have a face, it just stands there watching me." Clara's heart raced as she took a tentative step towards the bathroom. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and leave, to get as far away from that room as possible. But the rational part of her mind insisted that it was nothing, that Mrs. Whitaker was simply imagining things in her old age. Yet, the palpable fear in the woman's voice was enough to push Clara forward. The door creaked as she pushed it open with the tip of her flashlight. The bathroom was small, the tiles worn and cracked, the mirror above the sink slightly tarnished. But there was nothing unusual about it. No dark figure, no faceless man. Just an empty, silent room. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned back to Mrs. Whitaker, forcing a reassuring smile onto her face. "There's no one here, Mrs. Whitaker. It must have been a bad dream." But the old woman shook her head vehemently, her eyes wide with panic. No, it was here. I saw it. Standing right there in the corner. It's always watching me." Clara's unease deepened, but she kept her voice calm. "I'll stay with you for a while, okay? Just to make sure everything's all right." Mrs. Whitaker nodded weakly, her grip on the blanket loosening slightly. Clara pulled up a chair beside the bed and sat down, her flashlight resting on her lap, its beam illuminating the far corner of the room where the shadows seemed to dance in the dim light. She watched the bathroom door warily, half expecting something to emerge from the darkness, but nothing happened. Minutes turned into an hour, and slowly the tension in the room began to dissipate. Mrs. Whitaker's breathing evened out, and her eyes grew heavy with sleep. Clara felt her own eyelids droop, the exhaustion of the long day catching up to her. But just as she began to relax, a sound broke the silence. A faint shuffling noise that seemed to come from the bathroom. Clara's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, the beam wavering as she aimed it towards the bathroom door. The noise grew louder, a soft dragging sound that sent chills down her spine. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the relentless shuffling growing closer. Clara stood, her legs shaky, and took a cautious step towards the bathroom. The door was still ajar, the darkness within impenetrable. She hesitated, fear gnawing at the edges of her resolve. But she had to know. She had to see what was causing that noise. With a deep breath, Clara pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. The bathroom was just as empty as before, but the noise had stopped. She swung the flashlight around, the beam catching on the mirror above the sink. For a split second, she thought she saw something. A fleeting shadow, a figure standing just out of sight. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Her heart raced as she backed out of the bathroom, her skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. She could feel it now, an oppressive presence that seemed to fill the room, weighing down on her like a heavy blanket. The air was thick with it, stifling, suffocating. "Please go away," Mrs. Whitaker whimpered from the bed, her voice so small and frail. "Leave us alone." Clara wanted to tell her that everything was fine, that there was nothing to be afraid of, but the words caught in her throat. Because deep down she knew that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Just as she was about to call for backup, the lights flickered back on, bathing the room in harsh, artificial light. The oppressive presence seemed to lift, dissipating like smoke in the wind. Clara let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she pocketed the flashlight. "See? It's gone now," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. Mrs. Whitaker didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. Clara checked her pulse. It was weak, but steady. She had fallen asleep, exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. Clara quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. She leaned against the wall, her heart still racing, and took a moment to collect herself. The encounter had left her shaken, her nerves frayed. She told herself it was just an overactive imagination, a trick of the light. But no matter how many times she repeated that in her head, the unease wouldn't go away. The rest of the night passed without incident, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak and groan of the old building made her jump. By the time her shift ended, she was a bundle of nerves, desperate to leave the facility and the oppressive atmosphere that had taken hold of it. As she drove home, the early morning sun just beginning to peek over the horizon, Clara couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Whitaker's words. "It doesn't have a face." The phrase echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the terror she had seen in the old woman's eyes. Clara knew she needed to talk to someone about what had happened, but who would believe her? She could already imagine the skeptical looks, the dismissive comments. "It's just stress," they would say. "You're overworked, exhausted. It's all in your head." But deep down, Clara knew the truth. There was something in that room, something that defied explanation. And it wasn't just in Mrs. Whitaker's head, it was real. She had felt it too, that dark, faceless presence that had watched them from the shadows. Over the next few days, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even in the safety of her own home, she would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, only to turn and find nothing there. She began to dread her shifts at the care facility, especially the nights. Each time she approached room 217, a wave of anxiety would crash over her, making it hard to breathe. She considered requesting a transfer to the day shift or even quitting altogether, but something kept her coming back. Perhaps it was a sense of duty to the residents, or maybe it was the nagging curiosity that gnawed at her, the need to understand what she had experienced. Whatever it was, it drove her back to the care facility night after night. The figure didn't move, but the air grew colder, so cold that Clara could see her breath misting in front of her. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening, swirling like a vortex that threatened to swallow them whole. "Go away!" Clara screamed, her voice desperate. She grabbed the small cross that Mrs. Whitaker kept on her nightstand and held it out towards the figure. "In the name of God, leave this place." For a moment, the figure seemed to waver, its edges flickering like a flame in the wind. But then it stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if mocking her attempts to banish it. Clara's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, sapping her strength, her will to fight. But she couldn't let it win. She couldn't let it take Mrs. Whitaker. With a final surge of desperation, Clara lunged forward, swinging the cross towards the figure. The moment the cross passed through the shadow, a blood-curdling scream erupted from it, a sound so inhuman, so filled with rage and agony, that it made Clara's blood run cold. The figure recoiled, its form flickering violently as if struggling to maintain its shape. The room shook, the walls rattling as the shadow twisted and writhed, growing smaller and smaller until, with a final ear-piercing shriek, it exploded into a cloud of black mist that dissipated into the air. Silence fell over the room, the oppressive energy lifting as suddenly as it had appeared. The warmth slowly returned, and Clara collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Mrs. Whitaker was sobbing quietly, tears streaming down her face as she murmured prayers under her breath. Clara crawled over to her, wrapping her arms around the frail woman, holding her as they both shook with the aftershocks of terror. "It's gone," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's gone." But even as she said the words, she wasn't entirely sure she believed them. The memory of that faceless figure was burned into her mind, a dark stain that she knew would never fully fade. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Clara stayed with Mrs. Whitaker until morning, unwilling to leave her side. When the day shift arrived, she handed over her duties without a word, unable to explain what had happened, and left the facility as quickly as she could. The drive home was a long one, the events of the night replaying in her mind over and over. She couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow hadn't been fully vanquished, that it was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to return. That night, Clara barely slept, her dreams filled with nightmares of faceless figures in cold, suffocating darkness. When she awoke, drenched in sweat, she knew she couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't keep facing whatever it was that haunted room 217. The next day, Clara handed in her resignation. She told her supervisor that she needed time off, that the stress of the job had become too much to bear. But she didn't tell them about the shadow, or the faceless figure, or the terror that still clung to her like a shroud. Clara left the care facility and moved to a different town, far away from the memories of that place. But no matter how far she ran, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. In the dead of night, she would wake up, heart pounding, certain that something was standing in the corner of her room, just out of sight. And sometimes, when the shadows grew long and the night was at its darkest, she would catch a glimpse of a figure, tall and thin, with a face that was nothing but a void staring at her from the shadows. It never spoke, never moved, but she knew it was there, waiting, watching, and she knew that one day it would come for her too.